The air in this booth tastes like copper and stale cigarette smoke, a rotting bouquet of neglect that clings to the back of my throat. Outside, the world has been swallowed by a thick, oily void, leaving only this island of stuttering fluorescent light to mark the map. The hum of the refrigeration units isn't a mechanical sound. It's a low, rhythmic growl, like a beast slowly digesting its own organs in the dark. I sat at the laminate counter, my fingernails digging into the formica, and looked at the piece of yellowed paper taped next to the register. It wasn't typed. It was scratched in a frantic, jagged hand, the ink bleeding into the fibers of the page like a spreading bruise. The manager, a man whose skin looked like wet parchment stretched too thin over a bird skeleton, didn't give me a handbook. He gave me a death warrant disguised as a shift schedule. Rule 1. The fluorescent lights will flicker. Do not count the blinks. If you reach 13, the thing standing behind you in the reflection of the glass isn't a trick of the light anymore. I watched the tubes above me twitch, casting long, spasming shadows that danced across the linoleum like dying spiders. My pulse was a frantic drumming in my ears, a staccato rhythm against the silence of the desert. The silence out here isn't empty, it's heavy. It's a physical weight that presses against the windows, trying to find a crack, trying to seep into the warmth. Rule 2. If the radio begins to bleed static, let it. Do not touch the dial. The noise isn't interference, it's a language. If you try to tune it out, the voices on the other end will realize you're listening, and they'll start calling you by your mother's name. I kept my hands under my thighs, feeling the cold metal of the stool bite into my skin. The radio on the shelf behind the cigarettes started to hiss, a dry, rasping sound, like sandpaper on bone. It wasn't white noise. It was the sound of 1,000 dry throats trying to scream underwater. I stared at the door, the glass a dark mirror reflecting nothing but my own hollowed-out face and the rows of colorful, poisoned snacks that felt like plastic offerings to a god of hunger. Rule 3. Ignore the scratching at the back door. It is not a dog. It is not a person. It is the wind trying to wear a human shape, and it is very, very hungry. The sound started at precisely 3 a.m. A slow, rhythmic scraping of calcified nails against the steel frame. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was patient. It was ancient. My breath hitched, a jagged shard of ice in my chest. I focused on the list, my vision blurring as the overhead light buzzed with the intensity of a hornet's nest. Then I reached the rule highlighted in a dull, rusted red. The ink looked more like dried blood than pigment. Rule 4. If a black sedan pulls up to pump 4, do not look at the driver. Do not engage. Do not exist. Hit the lights, crawl into the crawl space beneath the register, and do not breathe until you hear the engine die and the silence return. The sedan doesn't have a license plate because it doesn't come from a place with roads. It comes from the gaps between heartbeats. It comes from the void. I felt the vibrations before I heard the sound. A low, subsonic thrum that made my teeth ache and the glass in the coolers rattle in their frames. Then, the headlights cut through the dark, 2 twin orbs of sickly, pale yellow that didn't illuminate the pavement so much as they erased it. The car was a long, sleek shadow, darker than the night around it, a hole in reality shaped like a vintage cruiser. It glided to a stop at pump 4 without a sound from its tires. The metal of the car looked wet, like it was coated in a layer of fresh bile. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird in a cage of bone. I reached for the light switch, my fingers trembling so violently I nearly missed. Click. The station plunged into a suffocating, dim gloom, lit only by the distant, dying glow of a single street lamp at the edge of the lot. I dropped to the floor, the linoleum cold and smelling of industrial bleach and old rot. I scrambled into the narrow space under the counter, pulling the wooden panel shut behind me. The air in the crawl space was thick with dust and the scent of damp earth. I pressed my hands over my mouth, my eyes wide in the dark. I could hear it now. The car door didn't creak. It groaned, a sound of metal being torn away from something organic. Then, footsteps. Not the sound of shoes on concrete, but a wet, heavy slapping sound, like slabs of raw meat being dropped on the ground. It was walking toward the door. The bells above the entrance didn't chime. They shrieked, a high, piercing wail that vibrated through my skull. Something was inside, something that smelled like ozone and a shallow grave. I closed my eyes and waited for the void to speak my name. The silence that followed was worse than the wail. It was a thick, pressurized thing that pushed against my eardrums until I felt the salt of my own blood in the back of my throat. I stayed pressed against the linoleum floor behind the counter, my spine curled like a dying insect. The orange sodium lamps outside flickered, casting rhythmic, jaundiced pulses of light through the glass. Every time the light surged, the shadows in the aisles stretched and snapped like black rubber. Every time it dipped, the world dissolved into a grainy, charcoal smudge. I didn't dare breathe. The air in the shop had changed. It was no longer the scent of stale coffee and cheap floor wax. It was the smell of a forgotten basement where the damp had turned to something sentient. It was the smell of ozone, of a sky about to break, and the cloying, sweet rot of a shallow grave where the earth had been too loose to keep the secret. The sound started then. It wasn't footsteps. It was a wet, rhythmic dragging. It sounded like a heavy sack of meat being pulled over broken glass. Scrape, squelch, scrape. The linoleum groaned under a weight it wasn't built to carry. I stared at the underside of the cigarette rack, watching the orange light catch on the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. Those tiny specks were the only things moving in my world, and they looked like sparks from a dying fire. The dragging stopped near the aisle with the motor oil and the coolant. I could hear the thing breathing, if you could call it that. It was a wet, rattling wheeze, like air being forced through a throat filled with wet sand. It was the sound of a lung that had forgotten how to be a lung. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a ribcage of iron, beating so hard I feared the thing would hear the percussion of my terror. I looked at the security monitor. The screen was a blizzard of grey and white. Static screamed silently on the display, but through the electronic snow, I saw a shape. It was a silhouette that defied the laws of anatomy. It was too tall, its limbs articulating at angles that suggested broken porcelain. It stood in the middle of the aisle, a jagged hole in reality. It didn't have a shadow. The orange light from the lamps outside seemed to avoid it, curving around its edges as if afraid to touch whatever that thing was made of. My hand moved instinctively toward the silent alarm button under the counter, but my fingers froze. What would the police find if they came? This wasn't a robbery. This was a haunting of the present tense. This was the void coming to collect a debt I didn't know I owed. If they pulled into that lot, they'd just be more meat for the grinder. A shadow fell over me. It didn't come from the lamps outside. It grew from the floor itself. The temperature dropped until I could see my own breath, a pale, shivering ghost escaping my lips. The dragging sound started again, but this time it was closer. Much closer. It was just on the other side of the counter. I squeezed my eyes shut so tight I saw stars. I tried to think of anything else. The humming of my refrigerator at home, the way the sun felt on a Tuesday afternoon, the sound of a car that wasn't a black sedan. But the void was greedy. It ate my memories and replaced them with the image of that car sitting out by the pumps. That sleek, obsidian beast that didn't reflect the light. It wasn't a vehicle. It was a puncture wound in the night. I heard a metallic clink, the sound of the coin jar on the counter being moved. Then, the sound of a voice. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a radio being tuned between stations, a cacophony of overlapping whispers, 1,000 dead tongues trying to form a single word. It was a guttural, vibrating rasp that resonated in my very marrow. It didn't speak a language I knew, but I understood the intent. It was asking for something. It was searching for the rhythm of a beating heart to steady its own chaotic existence. I felt a drop of sweat crawl down my temple, a slow, agonizing trail that felt like a hot needle. If it fell, if it hit the floor, the sound would be a thunderclap in this vacuum of dread. The entity leaned over the counter. I could feel the cold radiating off it, a literal frost that began to bloom on the edges of the lottery ticket display. The smell of the grave became a physical weight, a hand of rot pressing down on my chest. I felt the static on my skin, the hair on my arms standing up as the air became hypercharged. Through the narrow gap between the counter and the floor, I saw its feet. They weren't feet. They were bundles of pale, translucent fibers, twitching like the legs of a crab. They were stained with something dark and viscous, leaving smears of iridescent oil on the tiles. The orange light flickered once, twice, and then stayed dead. In the total darkness, the paranoia blossomed into a full, screaming bloom. I wasn't just in a gas station anymore. I was in the gut of a leviathan. The walls felt like they were pulsing, the rhythm of the store's hidden machinery turning into a slow, digestive thrum. I was the only thing left in a world of ghosts and chrome. Then, a new sound. A soft, rhythmic clicking, like a fingernail tapping on glass. It was coming from the front window. I opened one eye, peering through the gloom. Outside, under the dead lamps, the black sedan Saturday. The driver's side window was down just an inch. A pale, thin finger was tapping against the glass. The thing inside the store responded. It let out a low, vibrating hum that made the candy bars rattle in their wrappers. It began to move away from the counter, the dragging sound receding toward the door. Each scrape was a reprieve, a second of life I hadn't expected to have. I waited. I waited for the chime of the bells that would signal its exit. But the bells didn't chime. They shrieked again, that same lacerating wail that tore through the quiet like a razor through silk. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a tomb that had just been sealed. I stayed on the floor for what felt like hours, my muscles cramping into knots, my mind a jagged landscape of what ifs. Finally, I forced myself to look up. The store was empty. The orange lamps outside were back on, casting their sickly, rhythmic glow over the pumps. The black sedan was gone. There were no tire marks on the asphalt, no footprints on the linoleum. Just a smear of iridescent oil near the motor oil aisle and a layer of frost on the counter that was already beginning to weep into puddles. I stood up, my legs shaking so violently I had to lean on the register. I looked at the security monitor. The static was gone. The aisles were empty. But as I watched, the timestamp on the bottom of the screen began to run backward. Seconds, minutes, hours, spinning into a reverse blur. I looked out the window. The horizon wasn't where it was supposed to be. There were no trees, no road, no distant lights of the next town. There was only the gas station, an island of orange light floating in an absolute, velvet void. I was no longer in the middle of nowhere. I was in the middle of nothing. And I knew, with a soul-crushing certainty, that the sedan would be back. It was just circling the block of my own crumbling sanity, waiting for the next time I dared to blink. The fluorescent lights overhead didn't just hum. They screamed in a frequency only my marrow could hear, a jagged, electric death rattle that harmonized with the oppressive silence of the desert outside. I stood behind the counter, my fingers digging into the laminated wood until the splinters felt like holy relics. The orange light I had seen before, that mocking spark in the velvet void, had vanished, replaced by a darkness so absolute it felt physical, like wet tar pressing against the glass of the storefront. Then, the silence broke. It didn't break with a roar or a bang, but with a sound like rusted shears cutting through silk. It was the sound of tires on gravel, not rolling, but dragging, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let this thing pass over it. Two twin lances of light pierced the gloom, white and sterile, burning through the grime on the windows with a surgical intensity that felt like a violation. They weren't just headlights. They were holes punched into the fabric of the night, bleeding a cold, artificial radiance that stripped the world of its color. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. My lungs were filled with the sudden, metallic taste of ozone and the rotting sweetness of overripe meat. The black sedan didn't pull into the lot. It bled into it, a coagulated mass of shadow that was darker than the night surrounding it. It was a long, low-slung beast of obsidian, its paint job not glossy, but matte and textured like the skin of a deep-sea predator. It looked as though it had been forged in a furnace fueled by nightmares and quenched in the blood of the forgotten. The rules were clear. The rules were the only tether I had left to a reality that was rapidly dissolving into static. If a black sedan pulls up, hide. I didn't question it. To question was to invite the void in for a conversation. I dropped to the floor, my knees hitting the linoleum with a wet thud that sounded like a gunshot in the stagnant air. I crawled behind the counter, pressing my back against the cigarette rack, my heart hammering against my ribs like a panicked bird in a cage of bone. I could feel the presence of the car through the walls. It was a heavy, gravitational pull, a sinkhole in the center of my skull that threatened to drag my consciousness into its depths. Outside, the engine didn't idle. It didn't purr. It vibrated at a pitch that made the glass jars of beef jerky on the counter chatter like teeth. It was a rhythmic, wet thumping, the sound of a giant heart struggling to beat inside a lead chest. The headlights stayed on, casting long, distorted shadows of the gas pumps across the interior walls, shadows that seemed to move independently of the light, stretching and clawing at the ceiling. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the light was still there, burned into my retinas, a white-hot afterimage of my own impending erasure. I heard the door. Not the chime. The bell was silent, as if it feared to ring, but the sound of the latch turning with a slow, deliberate grind. The air in the station suddenly dropped 20 degrees. I could see my breath, a pale ghost of my own terror, rising in the dim light behind the counter. The smell hit me then, the scent of an open grave in the middle of a winter freeze, mixed with the sharp, acidic sting of industrial cleaner. Something was inside. Something that didn't belong in a three-dimensional world. The footsteps were wrong. They weren't the rhythmic heel-toe of a human. They were heavy, singular thuds, spaced too far apart, like someone dragging a heavy weight through mud. Thud. Drag. Thud. Drag. Each step sent a ripple of static through the air, making the skin on my arms crawl and the hair on my neck stand in jagged rows. The creature, or the driver, or the thing that wore the shape of a man, stopped on the other side of the counter. I could hear it breathing. It was a wet, rattling sound, the sound of a throat filled with broken glass and swamp water. It was the sound of a lung that had forgotten how to process oxygen. I stared at the underside of the counter, focusing on a dried coffee stain, trying to anchor my soul to that one mundane detail. If I looked up, I would see the void. If I looked up, I would become part of the static. The air around me began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. I felt a cold, oily sensation wash over me, a psychic pressure that demanded I stand up, that I offer myself to the obsidian god idling in the parking lot. It was an invitation to stop existing, to let the velvet darkness swallow the pain of being alive. The thing on the other side of the counter reached out. I saw a shadow fall over the floor, a hand that was too long, with fingers that had too many knuckles, stretching toward the register. It didn't touch anything. It just hovered, a silhouette of rot and ancient hunger. The static intensified until it was a physical weight, a roar in my ears that drowned out the thumping engine. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming, the iron taste of my own blood filling my mouth. I was a witness to something that should have remained buried in the foundation of the universe. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The breathing stopped. The dragging footsteps ceased. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the station was a tomb. Then, the sound of the door latch again. The heavy thud of the car door closing, not a metallic clink, but a dull, final sound, like a coffin lid being hammered shut. The headlights flickered, the white lances retracting from the room, leaving me in a darkness that felt bruised and violated. I heard the tires on the gravel again, that sickening, dragging sound receding into the distance. The static cleared, leaving my ears ringing with a high, mournful whistle. I didn't move. I stayed huddled in the dark, a pile of meat and fear, waiting for the sun that I knew might never come. The black sedan hadn't just appeared, it had marked the world. It had left a stain on the night that no amount of light could ever scrub away. I was no longer in the middle of nowhere. I was the epicenter of a rotting reality, and the car was just circling, waiting for the next time I dared to believe I was safe. I stayed there, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights, which now sounded like a funeral dirge for my own sanity. The void had looked at me, and though I had hidden, I knew it still had my scent. It would be back. It was always back. And next time, I wasn't sure if the counter would be enough to keep the nothingness at bay. The linoleum was a glacier of filth beneath my palms, cold enough to ache, but I welcomed the bite of the frost because it meant I was still alive to feel it. I pressed my spine against the particle board of the cigarette cabinet, feeling the flimsy would bow under my weight. My lungs were twin chambers of hot lead, screaming for a release I didn't dare grant them. Above me, the world had dissolved into a monochromatic nightmare. The humming fluorescent tubes didn't just illuminate the store, they pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic throb, a staccato heartbeat of dying gas and glass. The blue light from the Gatorade coolers bled across the floor like spilled chemicals, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the shelves and crawl toward my boots. The bell on the door hadn't rung. It never rang for them. Instead, there was only the sound of the atmosphere tearing, a low-frequency static that vibrated in my teeth, tasted like copper, and smelled like a mass grave left to fester under a summer sun. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the darkness behind my lids offered no sanctuary. I could hear it. Not footsteps. Not exactly. It was the sound of something heavy and wet being dragged across the tiles, a rhythmic slosh that suggested a body composed of loose organs and old secrets. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, hammering a frantic SOS that surely the thing on the other side of the counter could hear. Every beat felt like a gunshot in the calcified silence of the station. I counted the pulses to keep from screaming. 1, 2, 3. The dragging sound stopped. The air in the store shifted. The temperature plummeted until my breath began to hitch in my throat, forming a faint, white mist that felt like evidence of my existence, a confession of life in a place that demanded only death. I clamped my hand over my mouth, my fingers digging into my cheeks until I broke the skin. I couldn't breathe. To breathe was to invite the rot into my lungs. To breathe was to let the void know exactly where the meat was hiding. The silence that followed was worse than the static. It was a heavy, pressurized thing that pushed against my eardrums until they throbbed. Then, the scratching started. It began at the far end of the counter, a slow, deliberate rasp of something sharp, fingernails, or perhaps bone, trailing along the laminate. It sounded like a serrated knife being drawn across a chalkboard. It moved toward me with agonizing patience, savoring the hunt, tasting the cortisol radiating off my skin in waves. I looked down at the gap between the floor and the base of the counter. A shadow began to bleed through the blue light. It wasn't a shadow cast by an object. It was a physical stain, a pool of ink that seemed to eat the very light it touched. Within that darkness, I saw movement. Pale, spindly things that might have been fingers, if fingers were twice as long as they should be and possessed too many knuckles. They twitched against the tile, searching, feeling for the warmth of a human pulse. The smell intensified, a nauseating cocktail of ozone and ancient decay. It filled my sinuses, slick and oily, making my stomach churn with the urge to vomit. I bit down on my tongue, the metallic tang of blood mixing with the foul air. I had to remain a statue. I had to be a ghost. I had to be nothing. The scratching stopped directly above my head. I could hear it now, the creature's breath. It didn't sound like air moving through lungs. It sounded like wind howling through a hollowed-out skull. It was a dry, rattling hiss that carried the weight of centuries. It leaned over the counter. I could feel the wood creak under its impossible weight, the particle board groaning as if it were about to snap and drop the nightmare right into my lap. A single drop of something viscous and cold fell from the edge of the counter and landed on my knee. It burned. It was a liquid blackness that sizzled against my jeans, smelling of scorched hair and sulfur. Don't breathe. My chest was a furnace of agony. My vision began to swim, the blue light of the coolers blurring into a chaotic swirl of neon bruised with indigo. The edges of my consciousness were fraying, dissolving into the same static that filled the room. I felt the urge to gasp, to fill my starved cells with even the tainted air of the store, but I knew the moment I parted my lips, it would be over. The thing above me was a predator of sound, a scavenger of vibration. It fed on the cadence of a frantic heart and the shudder of a terrified lung. The counter creaked again, more violently this time. I looked up and saw the wood beginning to splinter. A sliver of something grey and translucent poked through a crack, a needle-thin filament that waved in the air like an insect's antenna. It sensed me. It was inches from my hair, vibrating with a low, subharmonic growl that made my very marrow ache. I focused on the dust motes dancing in the blue light, trying to detach my mind from the shivering wreck of my body. I thought about the road outside, the endless black ribbon of asphalt that led to nowhere, and the sedan that sat idling in the lot like a funeral carriage waiting for its passenger. I wondered if the driver was still inside, staring through the windshield with eyes that saw only the dark, or if the driver was currently leaning over me, searching for the soul it had come to collect. The filament retracted. The weight on the counter shifted. The dragging sound returned, but this time it was moving away. Slow, deliberate. Each wet slosh felt like a hammer blow to my nerves. I waited, my lungs burning so fiercely I thought they might actually ignite. I counted to 60, then to 100. The static began to recede, the high-pitched whine in my ears fading into a dull, throbbing ache. The smell of rot didn't vanish, but it thinned, replaced by the mundane sense of stale coffee and floor wax. I didn't move. I stayed pinned against the cabinet, a prisoner of my own terror. The blue light continued to flicker, a dying star in a sea of linoleum. I knew it was still there, somewhere in the periphery, lurking in the aisles of expired chips and rusted canned goods. It was waiting for the moment I let my guard down, for the moment I finally allowed myself that first, deep, ragged breath. My vision narrowed to a pinprick. The cold from the floor had seeped into my bones, turning my blood to slush. I felt a strange, detached sense of peace, the kind that comes just before the end. The void hadn't left. It had merely changed its shape. It was the shadow under the racks. It was the hum in the wires. It was the silence between the heartbeats. I finally let a sliver of air out through my nose, a silent, trembling exhale that felt like a sin. My lungs spasmed, demanding more, but I meted it out with surgical precision. I was a clockwork man, a machine of flesh and fear, operating on the barest margins of survival. The store was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that precedes an earthquake or a scream. I looked at the floor again. The black stain was gone, leaving only the pristine, clinical blue of the refrigerated glow. But as I watched, a single, bloody handprint appeared on the glass of the front door. Not from the outside. From the inside. It was small, the size of a child's hand, but the fingers were elongated, the tips ending in jagged, broken points. It was a mark. A promise. I realized then that the counter wasn't a shield. It was a coffin lid. The don't breathe rule wasn't about hiding. It was about preservation. If I didn't breathe, I wasn't alive. And if I wasn't alive, the thing from the sedan had no use for me. It wanted the spark. It wanted the heat of the struggle. The lights flickered one last time, a violent burst of white that blinded me, followed by a total, crushing darkness. The hum of the station died. The coolers fell silent. In the sudden, absolute void, I heard it. A soft, wet whisper, right against the shell of my ear. I can hear your heart. The voice wasn't a voice. It was the sound of dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. It was the sound of the end of the world. I didn't breathe. I turned my soul into a stone. I pulled the darkness into me until I was as empty as the gas pumps outside, as hollow as the sky above the desert. I waited for the touch of those long, cold fingers. I waited for the rot to consume the blue light. I waited, and in the silence, I became part of the graveyard shift, a permanent fixture of the nowhere, a ghost in a polyester uniform waiting for the sun that would never, ever rise. The sedan's engine roared to life outside, a low, guttural growl that shook the foundation of the building. The headlights cut through the front windows, two twin beams of impossible, blinding white that carved through the darkness of the store. They swept over the aisles, over the counter, and for a fleeting second, they illuminated the space where I sat today. I saw it then. Not the creature, but the shadow it left behind. A silhouette burned into the floor tiles, a scorched outline of something that defied geometry, something that had been standing directly in front of me the entire time, even when I thought it had moved away. The sedan peeled out, the tires screaming against the asphalt, the sound fading into the distance until it was nothing more than a memory of a threat. I stayed under the counter for 3 more hours. I didn't move until the first grey light of a false dawn began to bleed through the windows, and even then, I did it with the grace of a man walking on a tightrope over an abyss. My joints popped like dry kindling. My skin was grey, mapped with the blue veins of a corpse. When I finally stood up, the store looked normal. The lights were back on, humming their funeral dirge. The Gatorade was still blue. The cigarettes were still in their rack. But on the counter, right where the thing had leaned, was a layer of fine, black ash. I reached out a trembling hand and touched it. It was cold, colder than the ice in the back. I looked at the clock. It was 4 a.m. 3 more hours until my shift ended. 3 more hours of the static. 3 more hours of the void. I picked up the spray cleaner and a rag. I started to scrub the ash away, but no matter how hard I rubbed, the stain remained, a permanent shadow on the laminate, a reminder that once the black sedan pulls up, you never truly stop hiding. You just get better at holding your breath. The bell on the door finally rang. A soft, cheerful chime that should have brought relief. I didn't look up. I couldn't, because as the footsteps approached the counter, normal, human footsteps, I could still smell the rot. I could still hear the static. And when the customer spoke, his voice was the sound of dry leaves on a tombstone. "Do you have any water?" he asked. I looked at his reflection in the plexiglass. He looked like a man. He wore a suit. He had a face. But in the cold blue light of the coolers behind him, he had no shadow. "I'll for," I whispered, my voice a jagged wreck. He smiled, and I saw too many teeth. "Thank you. It's a long drive. The desert is so very empty." I watched him walk away, my hand gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. I didn't breathe. I wouldn't breathe. Not until the sun was high enough to burn the secrets out of the sand. And even then, I knew. The sedan was just circling the block. It was always circling. And next time, I wouldn't just hide. I would become the darkness itself, just to survive the night. The neon sign above the pumps groaned, a dying animal gasping its last electrical breath. It flickered in a violent, rhythmic spasm, White, black, white, black. In the strobe of that failing light, the world was no longer a continuous stream of time but a series of jagged, disconnected frames. Each flash of white was a needle in my eyes, revealing a desert bleached of its color, turning the sand into crushed bone. Each plunge into black was a descent into a void so thick I could feel it sliding down my throat like cold oil. Outside, the black sedan sat like a hole cut out of the universe. It didn't just lack light, it consumed it. It was a bruise on the face of the night, a silent, obsidian predator waiting for the heart of the world to stop beating. I crouched behind the counter, my fingers digging into the linoleum until my nails bled, listening to the silence. But it wasn't silent. Not really. There was a sound coming from the sedan, a low-frequency vibration that rattled my molars and made the glass jars of pickled eggs on the counter dance a slow, macabre jig. It was the sound of static, not the static of a radio, but the static of a soul being unmade. Then the door of the sedan didn't open so much as it dissolved. In the next strobe of white, I saw it. It wasn't a man. It was a suggestion of a man, a sketch drawn by a shaking hand using charcoal made from cremated remains. It lurched. It didn't walk. It moved in stuttering, impossible angles, its limbs snapping into place with the wet, crunching sound of breaking celery. Flash. It was 10 feet from the car, a silhouette of elongated rot. Flash. It was at the edge of the concrete apron, its head lolling at an angle that should have severed the spine. The light died again, and in the darkness, I heard the scrape. Scrape. Drag. Scrape. It was the sound of a heavy coat being pulled over sandpaper, or perhaps the sound of skin that had grown too loose for the meat beneath it. The strobing intensified. The neon sign was screaming now, a high-pitched whine that synchronized with the pulsing light. White. The thing was halfway to the glass door. Its face was a smear of grey features, eyes like thumbprints in wet clay, a mouth that was nothing more than a vertical slit leaking a thick, shimmering fluid. Black. I could smell it now. The scent was a physical blow, the stench of a cellar that had been sealed for a century, the cloying sweetness of gangrene, and the sharp, metallic bite of ozone. It was the smell of the end of things. White. It was inches from the glass. It didn't have fingers, only tapering, translucent stalks that twitched against the transparency of the door. It wasn't trying to open the handle. It was feeling for a weakness in the reality of the barrier. Black. I felt the air in the station grow cold, a frost blooming across the inside of the windows in the shape of screaming lungs. I pressed my back against the cigarette rack, the plastic edges biting into my spine. I was a witness to a crime against nature, a voyeur in a theater of the damned. The noir shadows of the aisles stretched and warped, becoming long, grasping hands that reached for my ankles. The high contrast of the room turned the spilled coffee on the floor into a pool of ink, deep enough to drown in. I stared at the door, my pupils dilating and contracting with the madness of the light. The creature outside was a jigsaw puzzle of discarded nightmares. Every time the light hit it, the pieces seemed to shift. One moment it had the jagged shoulders of a vulture. The next, it was a column of shivering, pale worms held together by a suit of oily rags. It began to tap. Not a knock. A tap. Tark. 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 The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, echoing the heartbeat I could no longer feel in my own chest. Each tap sent a ripple through the glass, a distortion that made the no-smoking sign peel and curl like burning skin. I realized then that the sedan wasn't just a vehicle. It was a pressurized chamber for the void, and this thing was the leak. The desert outside had vanished. There were no mountains, no highway, no stars. There was only the strobe, the sedan, and the lurching rot that wanted to be invited in. I tasted copper in my mouth, bitter, hot, and thick. My own fear was a physical entity now, a knot of thorns twisting in my gut. The creature leaned its forehead against the glass. The strobe light caught the movement of something beneath its skin, a frantic, undulating motion like a nest of spiders disturbed by a boot. It didn't have teeth, but when that vertical slit of a mouth opened, I saw rows of serrated bone, stained yellow with the bile of 1,000 forgotten sins. It wasn't looking at me. It didn't have eyes to look with. It was sensing the heat of my terror, feeding on the high-voltage dread that was pouring off me in waves. I was the only light source left in a world of absolute shadow, a guttering candle in a hurricane of static. The glass started to moan. A hairline fracture appeared where the creature's forehead touched the pane. It radiated outward, a spiderweb of silver lines that caught the strobe light and shattered it into a million blinding diamonds. The sound was a symphony of splintering ice. I knew that when the glass gave way, there would be no scream. There would only be the sudden, violent intake of the void. The station would be emptied, not just of me, but of the very concept of here. We would become part of the circling darkness, a footnote in the ledger of the Sedan. The strobing grew faster, a frantic, desperate pulse. Whitey black white. The world was vibrating. The shells were shedding their loads, cans of oil, bags of chips, bottles of water, all falling in slow motion, suspended in the staccato rhythm of the failing light. The creature pushed. The fracture widened. A sliver of the outside air bled through the crack, and it tasted like ash and static. It burned my lungs. It was the atmosphere of a dead planet, a place where the sun had been extinguished by a hand of smoke. I looked at the black sedan, still idling in the center of the lot. No exhaust came from its tailpipe. No engine hummed beneath its hood. It was a vacuum on wheels, a gateway that had forgotten how to close. And then, the strobing stopped. Total, crushing darkness. The hum of the neon was gone. The whine of the static was gone. There was only the sound of my own ragged, wet breathing and the distinct, terrifying click of a door handle turning from the outside. The glass hadn't broken. It had simply ceased to be an obstacle. In that absolute void, I realized that the sedan hadn't come to take me away. It had come to remind me that I was already gone. I was a ghost in a uniform, working a shift that ended when the universe did. I reached out into the dark, my hand trembling, and felt something cold, wet, and jagged press against my palm. It wasn't the counter. It was a face made of rot and ancient, unblinking hunger. And as the first sliver of the false dawn began to bleed over the horizon, a grey, sickly light that offered no warmth, I saw my own reflection in the obsidian paint of the sedan. My eyes were gone, replaced by the same thumbprints of clay. My mouth was a vertical seam. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was the thing that lurches. I was the static in the wires. I was the reason the next person to pull into the station would find only an empty building and the lingering scent of ozone and bone. The sedan began to roll forward, silent as a funeral shroud, and I didn't resist. I stepped into the darkness of the backseat, merging with the shadows until there was nothing left of the man who worked the graveyard shift. There was only the hunger and the endless, circling desert night. The door did not click, it exhaled. A soft, wet sound like a lung collapsing. The interior of the sedan was not a cabin but a throat, lined with velvet that felt like the skin of a peach left to rot in a cellar. I sat, or rather, I dissolved into the seat. There was no steering wheel, no dashboard, no scent of pine or leather. Instead, there was the smell of old copper and the ozone of a dying television set. The glass of the windows was thick, distorted, turning the world outside into a smear of charcoal and ash. The gas station, my sanctuary and my cage, began to recede. It looked small, a lonely tooth in the jaw of the desert. The neon sign for the pumps flickered one last time, a spasming, electric blue, before the fog swallowed a whole. This was not the mist of a cool morning. This was the grey, granular static of a void, a pulverized memory of light. It pressed against the windows, seeking entry, seeking to fill the hollow spaces where my ribs used to be. I felt the hunger then, not in my stomach, but in my marrow. It was a cold, jagged craving for the things I had left behind, the sound of a ticking clock, the taste of stale coffee, the weight of a copper penny in my palm. Those things were gone now. They were the currency of the living, and I had spent my last cent. The sedan moved with a sickening, liquid grace. There was no vibration of an engine, no grit of tires on asphalt. We were gliding over the surface of the world like a needle across a record that had already finished playing. Outside, the cold dawn began to bleed through the fog, but it brought no warmth. It was a bruised, sickly light, the color of a cataract. It revealed the desert for what it really was, a graveyard of geometry. I saw shapes in the mist, limestone towers that looked like frozen screams, and the skeletal remains of billboards that advertised nothing but the end of the road. I looked at my hands. They were translucent, the color of skimmed milk. I could see the dark, sluggish transit of something that wasn't blood moving through my veins. It was the shadow of the car, the essence of the sedan, stitching itself into my anatomy. I tried to remember my name, but the syllables were like dry leaves, crumbling as soon as I touched them. I was the passenger now. I was the witness. We passed a house. It stood alone in the grey expanse, its windows dark and gaping like empty sockets. I saw a figure standing on the porch, a silhouette wrapped in the same greyish fog that choked the horizon. It didn't wave. It didn't move. It simply watched us pass, its presence a heavy, leaden weight against the glass. I realized then that the sedan didn't just pick people up, it collected them. It was a rolling reliquary, a vessel for the discarded and the forgotten. We were the static in the signal, the hum in the wires, the thing you see out of the corner of your eye and choose to ignore. The despair was not a sharp pain. It was a dull, rhythmic throb, like the tide. It told me that this had always been the destination. The graveyard shift wasn't a job, it was a transition. The gas station was just a porch, a waiting room for the inevitable arrival of the black sedan. Every car I had served, every traveler I had watched disappear into the night, they had all been precursors to this. They were the lucky ones, the ones who had a place to go. I was the one who stayed until the darkness decided I was ripe enough to harvest. I felt a presence beside me. I didn't turn my head. I couldn't. My neck felt like it was made of rusted iron. But I felt the cold, the absolute zero of the passenger seat. There was no body there, just a concentration of the dark, a knot of shadow that was denser than the rest. It whispered without words, a sound like dry grass rubbing together. It told me about the hunger. It told me that the hunger was the only thing that was real. The sun, the stars, the love of a mother, the fear of a child, those were just distractions. The void was the truth, and the sedan was its gospel. The fog began to thin, revealing a landscape that made my soul recoil. We were no longer in the desert I knew. The ground was composed of white, bleached bone, ground down into a fine, choking dust. Great black monoliths rose from the earth, carved with runes that seemed to writhe and shift as the light touched them. This was the source of the static. This was where the night went when it was finished with the world. I saw the others then. Rows upon rows of sedans, identical to the one I occupied, parked in perfect, terrifying symmetry. They were waiting. Their doors were closed, their interiors filled with the same murky, underwater light. Inside each one sat a shadow, a man or a woman who had once worked a shift, who had once looked at the clock and hoped for the morning. We were an army of the absent, a congregation of the vanished. The car slowed to a halt. The silence was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against my eardrums until they felt ready to burst. The door beside me began to creak open, but there was nothing outside but the grey, the cold, and the endless stretch of the bone dust plains. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay in the velvet throat of the car, to be digested slowly by the darkness. But the hunger was pulling me. It was calling to the void inside me, a magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. I stepped out. My feet didn't make a sound on the white earth. I looked back at the sedan, and for a moment, the fog cleared just enough for me to see my own reflection in the black paint. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a smudge, a blur of charcoal and grief. My eyes were two dead stars, flickering with the last remnants of a light that had been extinguished centuries ago. I looked toward the horizon, where the cold dawn was finally breaking. But it wasn't a sun that rose. It was a great, lidless eye of pale fire, casting no shadows and offering no hope. It illuminated the entire plain, showing me the millions of us, standing beside our black cars, waiting for the command that would never come. There was no escape. There was no end to the shift. The desert was a circle, and we were the points upon its circumference, forever moving and forever still. I felt the hunger grow, a jagged, visceral ache that demanded to be fed, but there was nothing here to eat but the despair of the person standing next to me. I began to walk, not because I had a destination, but because the stillness was a different kind of death. Every step I took, the bone dust rose in little puffs of white, coating my legs, turning me into a statue of salt and sorrow. I passed a woman who looked like she had been standing there since the dawn of time. Her uniform was tattered, the name tag unreadable, but she held a gas nozzle in her hand as if it were a scepter. She didn't look at me. She was staring at the pale eye in the sky, her mouth open in a silent, eternal scream. I realized then that we were the fuel. The black sedans didn't run on gasoline. They ran on the essence of the people they took. Our memories, our regrets, our very identities were being siphoned off, dripped into the tanks to keep the cycle moving. The hunger I felt wasn't mine. It was the cars. It was the void's. And it was never, ever satisfied. The fog rolled back in, thicker than before, smelling of wet earth and ancient decay. It muffled the sight of the eye, turning the world back into a greyish blur. I found myself back near the Sedan, though I had walked for miles. The desert didn't let you leave. It just rearranged itself to keep you at the center of your own nightmare. I sat down on the bone dust, my back against the cold metal of the car. I thought about the gas station. I thought about the next person who would take the job. They would arrive in a beat-up truck, full of hope or desperation, and they would see the empty chair, the half-finished cup of coffee, the lingering scent of ozone. They would hear the rules. They would be told to hide if the black sedan pulled up. And they would fail, just like I did. Because the sedan doesn't pull up to take you away. It pulls up to show you that you've already gone. I closed my eyes, but the darkness was no different from the light. I felt my skin becoming leather, my bones becoming frame and chassis. I felt my heart slow until it was just a dull, mechanical thud, a rhythmic clicking like a cooling engine. I wasn't sitting against the car anymore. I was becoming part of it. The hunger was fading, replaced by a terrible, hollow cold. The transition was almost complete. Soon, I would be the one driving. I would be the one pulling up to the lonely stations in the middle of nowhere, the one waiting in the shadows of the backseat for the next soul to surrender. I would be the funeral shroud, the silent passenger, the guardian of the endless night. The greyish fog began to swirl, forming patterns that looked like faces I used to know. They were mocking me, their features twisting into expressions of hideous glee. They knew. They had always known. There is no dawn in the desert. There is only the long, cold wait for the next shift to begin, and the knowledge that the graveyard is never full. I reached out and touched the bone dust, watching it sift through my translucent fingers. It was so quiet, so incredibly quiet. The only sound was the distant, muffled roar of a sea that didn't exist, the white noise of a universe that had forgotten we were here. I didn't resist when the shadows began to pull me under. I didn't scream when the cold finally reached my core. I just leaned back and let the darkness take what was left. There was no man who worked the graveyard shift. There was only the sedan, the fog, and the hunger that would circle the desert forever. The dawn was a lie. The light was a trap. And we, the shadows in the backseat, were the only truth left in a world of rotting dreams and static. I waited for the door to open again. I waited for the next stop. I waited to see who would be the next to merge with the shadows. The desert night was a hungry thing, and it was my turn to hunt. I felt the wheels that weren't wheels begin to turn, and the station, that tiny, flickering spark of reality, disappeared into the void of my rearview mirror. They never left. None of us ever did. We just changed shape, becoming the very thing we feared, the monsters in the black sedans, forever patrolling the borders of a world that had already moved on without us. The despair was absolute, a perfect, crystalline weight that anchored me to the void. And as the car began to roll forward once more, I realized that I wasn't the passenger anymore. I was the hunger itself, and I was starving. The grey fog thickened, turning into a wall of solid smoke. The air grew heavy with the taste of wet ash. I felt the sedan lurch, a sudden, violent movement that sent a jolt of static through my entire being. We were accelerating, leaving the plains of bone behind, heading deeper into the heart of the dark. I looked out the window one last time. I thought I saw a light, a small, yellowish glow in the distance. A house, a fire, a hope. But as we drew closer, I saw it was only a reflection of the pale eye, a mocking glimmer in a puddle of stagnant oil. There was nothing out here but us. The darkness was not an absence of light, it was a presence. It had a texture, like wet fur, and a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers layered over one another. It spoke of the beginning and the end, of the cycles of the moon and the slow decay of the stars. It told me that I was home. I settled into the void, the velvet throat of the car finally closing around me. The hunger was a steady hum now, a background radiation that fueled my new existence. I was the graveyard shift. I was the middle of nowhere. And if you see me, if you see the black sedan pulling up through the greyish fog of a cold dawn, don't bother hiding. I've already found you. The static grew louder, a deafening roar that drowned out every memory I had left. My mother's face, the smell of rain on hot pavement, the sound of laughter, it all dissolved into the grey. I was a ghost in the machine, a ripple in the void. I was the silence between heartbeats. We drove on, through the endless, circling desert night. The road ahead was a ribbon of black glass, reflecting nothing but the void above. There were no stars, only the pale, lidless eye that watched our progress with indifferent hunger. I felt a sense of peace then, a terrible, hollow serenity. The despair had reached its zenith and shattered, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. I knew my purpose. I knew my place. I was the watcher. I was the taker. The car began to slow. I could feel the familiar pull of a destination, a point of light in the grey expanse. Another station. Another lonely soul standing under the flickering neon, watching the fog roll in. I leaned forward, my shadow fingers brushing the back of the driver's seat. I could feel the anticipation radiating from the car, a low-frequency vibration that made the bone dust on my skin dance. The door began to exhale. I looked out through the tinted glass, watching the figure at the pumps. They looked so small, so fragile, a tiny spark of warmth in a universe of ice. They were checking their watch. They were looking at the road. They were waiting for the morning. They didn't know that the morning was a ghost. They didn't know that the night had already claimed them. I felt a flicker of something, a memory of pity, but it was gone as quickly as it came, swallowed by the roar of the static. There was only the hunger now, only the void. I merged with the shadows of the backseat, becoming one with the dark, and I waited. I waited for them to see the car. I waited for them to hear the silence. I waited for them to realize that the graveyard shift never ends. The sedan came to a full stop. The fog curled around the pumps like a lover, dampening the light, softening the world. I watched the person approach, their steps hesitant, their eyes wide with a fear they couldn't name. They reached for the door. I smiled, though I had no mouth. "Welcome to the shift," I whispered into the static. The door opened, and the cold dawn of the desert swallowed us both. The grayness was absolute. The silence was final. And as the sedan began to roll forward once more, silent as a funeral shroud, I knew that we were finally, truly, alone. The endless night continued its circle, and we were just another part of the orbit. A black sedan, a grayish fog, and a hunger that would never be satisfied. There was no man. There was only the shadow. There was only the void. And the void was beautiful in its despair. I watched the station disappear in the rearview mirror, a dying ember in a world of ash. It was the last thing I would ever see of the world I once knew. From now on, there would only be the bone dust, the pale eye, and the silent, gliding transit through the dark. I closed my eyes, or the things that were now my eyes, and let the static take me. It was a cold, jagged music, the soundtrack of a world that had finished its story and was now just waiting for the lights to go out. And in that darkness, I was finally, utterly, at rest.